Oh yeah. Oh yeah. The MRI knows. Yeah.
If you want, any other side of it.
I'm quite happy to not be on the screen. That's fine with me. That's good, isn't it? All right, we should be soon good to go, I believe. Getting a thumbs up, fantastic. I'll just welcome to people just joining us now. We're getting sorted. Some technical issues have been mostly fixed, we think. Our screen is currently on the live watch party that we have going on campus. So hello from those people to the internet. Let me just get myself underway here. Right. Welcome. I just want to quickly acknowledge that we're meeting on Gadigal country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging who may be here and who are the custodians of this country. Welcome to the EPS Symposium. The purpose of this is to connect staff and students from around the campus, postgraduate students, to hear from one another about research and faith and how those two things might link, as is specifically our topic today, and also kind of other things maybe around ethics, just around what it's like to be staff and students here, and to kind of just meet, connect with one another in this odd time. It's nice to actually connect in some way, regardless of the circumstances. So today we are hearing from Chris Watkin, who is zooming in for us from Melbourne. Thank you for coming. We are going to hear from him. The topic we've kind of given our heading, contributing to your field in light of the gospel. Chris is going to speak a bit about what that looks like for his kind of particular research, and then we perhaps might be able to ask him sort of some questions after that about perhaps how he ended up where he did, or those kinds of things. So please feel free to jot down questions if they come up. And it would also be great for us to maybe hear from one another at the end. So it may be that you have a particular situation or circumstance that seems related to what Chris presents on, and it would be great to hear from those as well. I believe we have some kind of bouncing across here and physically here and internet here, so we'll see how that goes, but hopefully we'll be all good to go. Right, so Chris, without any further ado, I might hand over to you. Thank you again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Matt, for the invitation. I'm just going to spend a moment sharing my screen here. And there we go. Fantastic. It's such a thrill for me to be able to share with you guys today. My wife went to Sydney Uni a little while ago, and this is the closest I've ever got to visiting her old university. So it's quite a thrill for me to be able to share this material with you guys. And also because it's something that's really close to my heart, I guess. I've been a Christian since I was 15, and I've been quite a while in academia. And so thinking about how those two things sort of relate to each other has been, I guess, a big part of my life for almost 20 years now. And so what I'm hoping to do today is just to be able to share some things that I've picked up along the way, some advice I've been given, some biblical principles that I've been taught. And my hope and my prayer is that will bless you and encourage you and help you in your own journeys in academia as Christians. So let's just begin with a word of prayer, if we could, and then I'll go straight in. So let's pray. Dear Father God, you've given us so many wonderful gifts and opportunities, our bodies, our minds, our place in a university, in a country that's relatively stable and not at war, the time to read and think. And we're humbled by the riches that you've put in front of us, Lord. And we want to be good and faithful servants. We want to try and use them wisely. And we pray that you would use this session to help us all to think through in a biblical way what that might look like for each of us individually. Amen. Amen. So I'm going to try and address 4 questions, if I can, in the about half an hour I've got to speak today. I'm going to try and look at, first of all, just why should we contribute to our gospel, to our discipline in the light of the gospel? Well, what's the biblical rationale for that? Secondly, I'm going to have a look at what the gospel is in the light of which we should contribute. And I'm going to have a look at how, that's the nitty-gritty section, is section 3, how we can contribute to our field in the light of the gospel. And then I'm going to finish off, hopefully, if there's a moment, with just some practical tips and tools for how to integrate gospel and studies. So first of all, then, why contribute to our field in the light of the gospel? It's sort of obvious, but it's one of those questions that the deeper you dig, the harder it gets to answer. I think the first thing to bear in mind about this is that everybody will necessarily contribute to their field in the light of something. And the only question that remains to be answered is what we will contribute in the light of, not whether we will contribute in the light of something. So what I'm trying to get at here is that everybody brings to academic study and to anything else in life a certain vision of the good life, a certain vision of what's worth doing in life. We've all got one of those, whether we like it or not, whether we can articulate it ourselves or not. Everybody's got a sense of the good. There's a wonderful quote from Augustine's City of God that I just want to share with you to get this idea of how the good draws us into different activities. He says, as the body is borne along by gravity, so the spirit is carried by love wherever it goes. And I think the relevance of that for us is that what we love in that deep, rich theological way will shape our approach to our academic discipline. So, for example, someone is studying climate science, doing a PhD on climate science. Why might she be doing that? Well, it might be because she wants to save the world. It might be because she wants to make a name for herself and become famous. It might simply be because she really enjoys it. And it's most likely to be some sort of combination of those 3 things. But in each of those cases, she's driven by a vision of the good, but by a certain love. Another way of thinking about it is that everyone will contribute to their discipline in the light of some gospel or other, some sense of what it means to live a good and fulfilled life. And the only question that remains is, which gospel will we contribute to our field in the light of? And so that leads us to the second piece of this jigsaw puzzle, I guess. Why contribute in the light of the biblical gospel rather than any other possible vision of the good life that's out there? And I guess the most obvious answer there is because that's what God commands us to do. You know, there's much more to say, but this is where you start, isn't it? Because in the area of work that we study, just as in the whole rest of life, that's what being a follower of Jesus is. It's right there, isn't it, in Colossians 3, verses 23 and 24. Whatever you do, says Paul, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. And given that our work falls under this category of whatever we do, then we should do it in this way. We should do it, our studies, our reading, our writing, our presenting at conferences, for the Lord. And not to contribute to our field, therefore, in the light of the gospel is to be disobedient to God and to this command here in the Bible. So far, we've got this general idea that everything that we should do, including our work, should be done for God. But that doesn't really mean a huge amount. It's not to use a rather clumsy word, it's not actionable. It's not, I'm really going into management speak now, it's not operationalizable until we've got a sense of what that gospel is that we're contributing in the light of, because that's going to shape the way that we contribute. So let's give some sharp edges to this idea of gospel. The New Testament term evangelion, as you know, is used in particular ways in the New Testament. Not the whole of God's story is called gospel in the New Testament. And if you sort of make a list of all the verses where that word is used, you find that they're referring to one or more of the birth of Christ, the death of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, or the return to judge of Christ. It's always in one of those four contexts, sometimes more than one, that the word gospel is used in the New Testament. But what I want to do for the purposes of this session is put those truths in a broader context. If you like, show the solution in which they're suspended in the Bible. But what I want to do for that is take the framework that a lot of theologians have used for understanding the whole Bible story of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation, this big four-step summary of the whole Bible story: creation, fall, redemption, consummation. It's what tends to get called, or at least did until relatively recently, a worldview. Now, some people today don't like the idea of worldview. I think it's fine. I don't mind it myself. But if that word rankles with you, think of it as a culture or a way of engaging with the world, or a big story. This idea of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation is incredibly powerful as a tool for Christians to engage with the whole of life, and therefore also with our studies, because it gives a rhythm, it gives a pattern to the whole of reality, it gives a pattern to human beings and to the world. If you want to dig further into this, and if this is something that intrigues you, have a look at that book, the title of which I've put on the slide there. Herman Dooyeweerd is an early 20th century Dutch theologian, and he wrote a book called The Roots of Western Culture, where he teases out the importance of this creation, fall, redemption framework in contrast to some of the ways of looking at the world out there. So this then is the framework in terms of which Christians engage with everything out there in the world, including our disciplines. And we're going to unpack exactly what it looks like to engage with our disciplines through this framework a little bit later in the talk. But what I want to do now is move on to our third question. What contribution are we making to our disciplines in the light of the gospel? And I think the first thing to say here is that let's avoid the reductive position of saying that the only contribution that we make is in our academic writing. I want to take a much bigger picture view than that. I want to say that we need to take account of the whole of our lives as academics when we think about the contribution that we're making to our discipline. And part of this is because academia, like all jobs, I suppose, tries to reduce our complexity as human beings. Tries to make us fit into the mold of publication and grant writing machines, or tutoring robots, or at any rate something less than the rich and complex people we are in all our fullness in Christ. And therefore I think it's important that we don't follow this reductive trend in narrowing our understanding of what a contribution can be, but we try and take the broadest picture of what it means to contribute to our disciplines. And in order to try and keep that big picture, I'd invite us to think about our contribution in terms of four categories. Here we are. Contacts is the first one. This is simply the human contacts that my lecturing job or my PhD candidacy brings me into contact with. So it's all the relationships that make up my life. It's the people I'm involved with at work, my colleagues, administrators in my department, people I correspond with, the person who cleans my office if I've got one, people whose books I read, and my fellow students. All the relationships that my place in academia brings into my life. The second category is context. And here I'm thinking about the way that I approach my work. So this is not specific to a particular field. For a philosopher or a scientist, this might be quite similar. It's the how I do my work. So for example, do I attack those that I don't agree with, either verbally or in writing? Do I ignore emails from people below me in the academic pecking order, but always answer emails from people above me in the academic pecking order? Do I set boundaries on my time for working, or do I let it take over my life? It's that sort of question in this second category of context. Thirdly, content. And this is where each discipline is very specific to itself. It's the nitty-gritty details of my academic discipline. How do I take a Christian approach to the particular issues and questions and frameworks that I'm dealing with in my research? So in my case, that will be, how do I take a Christian approach to contemporary French philosophy? And that's the bit that's going to look very different, I think, for each of us. And the fourth one is competence. This runs the other way. So how being a Christian changes me in the way that I can contribute to the church and to Christian mission. So for example, someone that I work with is a researcher in economics and stats, and he helps out his church running their budget and planning and projecting and helping them to grow and so forth. And that's one way that he uses his academic competence to serve the church. And that's another way that we can bring these two areas of our life together. And I think when we think about these four categories, it's really important to remember that we're not going to be contributing equally in each of these four ways throughout our whole academic career. There's going to be seasons when we're much closer to one of these than to the others. For example, when you start out on a PhD, it's very unlikely that you're immediately going to be able to rewrite your discipline in the image of Christ and engage with it in a deep theological way. You've got to find your feet in it first. You've got to understand how the discipline works. And so early on in a PhD, your contribution might be much more in terms of contacts relating to each other in a Christ-like way. And then as you go on, you might drift a little bit further towards content. And therefore, I just want to say it's okay if you don't know what a Christian approach to your discipline is right now. That doesn't sort of simply fall into your lap in day one. That takes work and reading and thinking and getting to know the discipline. But that doesn't mean you're making no contribution because our contribution is multifaceted. It can be in each of these four ways. I'd just encourage you to think as you continue listening to this, where do you think you're strong in terms of those four categories? And where do you think you're perhaps a little bit less strong and you might need to put a bit of emphasis and focus in the coming months? I want to focus on one biblical passage really at the heart of this presentation today. And it's one that I'm sure is familiar to all of us, and it's often used in this sort of discussion about faith and work. It's the moment when Jesus is asked about paying taxes to Caesar. Let me just read it to begin with. So they asked Jesus, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." Well, he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. Imagine this sort of exchange recontextualized to an academic conference. I don't know if you've noticed this, but sometimes some of the most cutting negative questions at academic conferences are presaged by the most glowing sort of praise. So someone will say, "I want to start off by really thanking you for that thought-provoking paper." That's a sign, isn't it? Thought-provoking. It's not good when someone says your paper's thought-provoking. You raised a lot of interesting questions, but they continue. "Have you stopped beating your wife?" And then you're in the headlights and you've got to answer. Well, rephrased in an academic context, the question that they're asking Jesus is this: do you try to do your secular job really, really well? In which case you're not really a keen Christian, are you? Or do you just use your secular job to fill in the time before you can do Christian things in the evening? In which case, we're going to tell your supervisor. It's the question he can't win. Whatever he answers, he's tripping himself up, either as a collaborator or as a zealot. And they're going to be able to sort of box him into a corner, whatever he answers. And so, as we know, Jesus's answer hinges on the coin that he's shown, when in verse 24, he says, whose likeness and inscription does this have? And the word for likeness here is icon, the same word that the New Testament uses for human beings created in the image, in the icon, of God in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 7. And so what Jesus is doing is he's introducing, I don't know, what you might call a parallax view, a double vision into this passage, because there are two images in play. There's the image on the coin, which is the picture of Caesar, but Caesar himself is an image, because he's made in the image of God, and so is everybody else who's present on that day. And Jesus's principle is this. He says, give the thing to the person whose image it has. So the coin goes to Caesar, but the implication is you and I, in our very selves, who bear the image of God, should be given to God. And this means, I think this is crucial for our understanding of how this passage helps us in our situation. This avoids a dichotomy between, on the one hand, giving to Caesar, and on the other hand, giving to God. So, for example, every hour of my time, I've got to decide, do I give it to Caesar or do I give it to God? It avoids that sort of dichotomy. Because the coin, in Jesus's way of looking at it, it is an image of an image. Caesar's head is on the coin, but Caesar himself is the image of God. So it's not two equal and opposite things. It's not two things divided from each other. So then, let's circle back to our question for this session. How does that help us to think about the way that we do our academic work? I think there are 2 points. Number one, giving to Caesar is transfigured by our giving to God. In other words, my giving to Caesar is part of my giving to God. Paying taxes is, so to speak, a gift to Caesar. But paying taxes is also, and at the same time, a gift to God, because it's part of my Christian duty to pay taxes, Romans 13, verses 6 to 7. So I'm giving to Caesar what's Caesar's, but in a way that recognizes that everything, including Caesar, including my very self, belongs to God. And therefore, this second gesture of giving to God what's God's actually gathers up the first gesture of giving to Caesar what's Caesar's in its own transcendent offering. Part of me offering my whole self to God is under God to give to Caesar what's Caesar's. So Jesus cuts across the two options that are offered to him. He gets out of the nasty question asked to him at the academic conference. And to get slightly philosophical for a moment, we could say that he diagonalizes this dichotomy. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God what's God's fits into neither of the boxes that he was offered in the question. And it shows both of them to be reductive. It shows both of them to be heresies of the more complex biblical position, which is to give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to give to God what's God's. And this principle is captured beautifully, I think, by Augustine in his Confessions. It's a really dense quotation. Let me try and read it slowly. Augustine's addressing God. He's speaking directly to God in the Confessions, and he says, "He loves you less who, together with you, loves something which he does not love for your sake." Let me just say that once more. It's a mind-bending sentence. He loves you, God, who together with you loves something which he does not love for your sake. In other words, it diminishes our love for God if we love anything at all, in a way that is unconnected to him, as if he'd not created it in the first place or given it to us in the context of a relationship with him. It's like a child. Imagine a child who receives a wonderful gift on Christmas morning from his parents and then greedily takes it up to his room, locks the door, and plays with it all by himself, even without saying thank you. That's what it's like to love things apart from God, to take God's good gifts and to enjoy them without reference to him. But Augustine's point is not just a negative one here. It's not just bashing us over the head. He's got a positive side, which is every good gift that we enjoy from God. So our life, our health, our relationships, our career, our holidays, our gadgets, our academic discipline, all of that should be used as kindling on the fire of our love for God. It should be loved, in other words, for God's sake, not for its own sake. And this is Jesus' principle in paying taxes. He says, do your civic duty, pay your taxes, but do it in a way that makes it part of honoring God, not something done apart from him with no reference to him. So therefore, to love God is not to hate everything else. I think some people think that that's what it means to be a Christian. To love God is not to hate everything else, but it's to gather everything else under the love of God and to love him in doing what we do. And this, I think, is an incredibly liberating truth for Christians, because it means that there's no sacred secular divide in our lives. It's not that we do work over here for our employer and then we stop doing that, and then we start doing the Christian stuff when we go to church on Sundays, and then we stop doing that and then we start doing the work again. That's not a biblical view of how life fits together. That our work should be part of our offering to God. It's part of our ministry. It's part of our obedience to God's commands. And this prevents us from saying two things, both of which are really damaging. It prevents us from saying, on the one hand, well, you know, my work is my worship, therefore I don't need to come to church or lead a Bible study because my ministry is my work. But it also stops us from saying, on the other hand, well, the only thing that I do that has significance for God's kingdom is the Bible study that I lead, and everything else will be burnt up. I think it prevents us from those two simplistic views of the way in which the whole of our lives fit together. Both of those views are defective. They both falsely dichotomize our giving to Caesar and our giving to God in precisely the way that Jesus is undermining in this passage. Secondly, giving to Caesar is not only transfigured by giving to God, it's also conditioned by giving to God. Think of it this way. If all my giving to Caesar is also a giving to God, and if Caesar himself is ultimately God's, and so am I, then my commitment to this world and to this age and to my academic studies cannot be ultimate, because Caesar doesn't own me in the way that God does. He can rightly demand of me my taxes, and it's right that I pay them, but he has no authority over my very self, because I myself am not in the image of Caesar. I'm in the image of God. But of course, God, on the other hand, can rightly demand of me my very self, because I myself am in his image, and because he's redeemed me from slavery to sin to belong to him. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 23, you were bought at a price, do not become slaves of people. And so what I give to Caesar, therefore, can only ever be a subset of what I give to God. And what I give to Caesar must harmonize with my giving to God, because everything belongs to God, including me. And this will always mean that sooner or later, there will be, for every Christian academic, red lines in our contributions to our discipline that, if we came up to them, we wouldn't want to cross. So for Daniel, for example, working in the University of Central Babylon, it was eating meat from the king's table. He drew the line there. He said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to learn the astrology of the Babylonians. I'm going to learn the language. I'm going to let my name be changed, but I'm not going to eat meat from the king's table. That was his red line in assimilating into that academic context. For the runner Eric Liddell in the film Chariots of Fire, it was training on a Sunday. That was something he wasn't prepared to do. It might be something for us as small as being okay with letting a colleague down in order to prioritize family in a particular circumstance. But what I don't want to do is provide you with a list, because then it becomes pharisaical, doesn't it? I just want to introduce the principle that if all of our giving is a giving to God, there will be red lines sooner or later for us. And each of us needs to work those out for ourselves before God. And this has implications. It means that our loyalty and our attitude to our studies are likely to be more complex than the loyalty and the attitude of our colleagues. We're going to have to wrestle with things that most people who are not Christians in our disciplines don't have to wrestle with. And I guess one question for us is, are we ready for that? And there are likely to be lines that we have to draw. Some of them may well be costly. They might cost us esteem, they might cost us authorship, they might in extreme circumstances cost us our positions. But unless I think we have that category of there may be some things that I simply can't do, then when those things do come, they will shock us and take us off guard. And I don't want that to happen for me or for any of you guys. Francis Schaeffer's got a really perceptive line in his Christian Manifesto. He says, if there's no room for civil disobedience, the government is in the place of God. And I think we can rewrite that for academia. We can say, if there's no room for scholarly disobedience, then the academy is in the place of God. Our ultimate allegiance is not to the academy. Okay, some practical tips and tools as we try and finish off now. The first one is just a tip that I've found incredibly helpful in my own journey thinking these things through over the years. It's a term that John Stott uses in his book, The Contemporary Christian, and he calls it double listening. Let me let Stott explain it in his own words. He says, we are called to double listening, listening both to the word and the world. We listen to the word with humble reverence, anxious to understand it, and resolved to believe and obey what we come to understand. We listen to the world with critical alertness, anxious to understand it too, and resolved not necessarily to believe and obey it, but to sympathize with it and to seek grace to discover how the gospel relates to it. I just want to highlight two aspects of this. The first one, and I'm just going to pop a link in the chat if I can at the moment, here we go, is to an idea that I explore at much greater length elsewhere, and if you follow the link, you'll come to it, but that I just want to very, very quickly sketch here in a couple of minutes. It begins with a bold claim, and the bold claim is that every academic discipline has a gospel, which is part of that discipline's view of the world. And it's important to be sensitive to that particular view of the world, and to be able to engage with it in its specificity. And often this is a view of the world that's cultivated by the discipline itself. And sometimes it simply happens to be the view of the world that is characteristic of those who are very good at the discipline. There'll be certain things, and think about your own discipline as I walk through this quickly, there'll be certain things that every academic discipline notices in the world more than most people notice it. And there might also be certain things that every academic discipline is blind to in the world more than the average citizen. There are some things in the world that colleagues in that discipline tend to value more than average, and other things that colleagues in that discipline might tend to avoid or dislike more than average. And that begins to build up a particular narrative about reality within an academic discipline. And this disciplinary narrative about reality will relate to the Bible's narrative about reality somehow. It will relate to creation, fall, redemption in a particular way, reflecting some parts of it, misunderstanding, changing, simplifying other parts of the biblical narrative. And one exercise that we can do to try and discern the narrative of our academic field is something that we can call storyboarding our discipline. A storyboard, this is a storyboard from a scene in The Empire Strikes Back. It's the key frames, the key moments in a particular scene. It's not all the information that you need to shoot a scene, but it's the key ideas that then you can use to make a movie. And the storyboard approach to our disciplines is similarly not concerned with the fine details of the discipline, but the broad brushstrokes, the broad picture of the world that emerges from the discipline. The biblical storyboard, if you like, in its simplest, is creation, fall, redemption. But each of our academic disciplines is going to have particular answers or particular responses to these 6 categories, I think. Now, I haven't got time to go through them today. It's all on that link, which is from the website thinkingthroughthebible.com. If you want to follow them through, feel free to do that. But I would commend this exercise to you as a way of really getting inside the skin of your discipline and becoming aware and sensitive to the way that it looks at the world, that is different, that is distinctive. Listening to the word now, so that was listening to the world, and storyboarding your discipline, listening to the word now, being intentional about the reading that we do as Christians. Now, my guess is that when it comes to our disciplines, most of us are listening to the world. We read the literature in our area of study. We go to conferences. We take part in conversations. But I guess the question that I've got for us today is, how are we going at listening to how God's word speaks into our discipline? What was, if you're a geneticist, what was the last Christian book you read on genetics? If you're a politics student, what was the last Christian book you read on politics, or just on being an academic in general? The danger for us, and I think it is a real danger, and I think humanly speaking, it does have the potential to shipwreck our faith if we don't address this over time. That the danger is we end up something like this, that we've got huge hulking academic biceps. We're really strong in our disciplinary area. We can go head to head with the experts, but we've neglected our biblical and theological quads, if you like, and therefore we're all out of proportion. And the faith that we've got begins over time to seem quite Sunday schoolish to us. It's just not as sophisticated as the way that we're accustomed to thinking about our studies. And as that difference gets bigger and bigger, I think it makes us look at our faith more and more, a little bit down our noses, as something that's not quite up to speed intellectually. Now, of course, this is a tragedy because the history of Christianity is littered with deep reflection upon the truths of the faith that can go toe-to-toe with any academic discipline. If you think Augustine, Calvin, people writing in our own day, it's there, the literature's there. The question is, are we keeping pace with the level of sophistication of our reading in the discipline with the level of sophistication of our reading of theology? And if there's a big gap there, I think that should begin to ring alarm bells for us, for our long-term spiritual health. One way of trying to get a handle on that is to just think in the last month, what have you read in each of these 4 categories? So non-Christian stuff related to your discipline. So that's going to be all your textbooks, all your academic papers. Christian stuff related to your discipline, like a Christian book or article or blog post or podcast on being a Christian in politics or in genetics or whatever. Non-Christian, non-Christian, non-discipline related. So that's everything, all the media you're consuming that's not to do with your discipline, that's not Christian. Netflix is in there, for example. And Christian non-discipline related. So it's your devotional reading, it's any Christian books that are not related to your discipline. And just try and tot up for the last month or the last 3 months, list all the titles, all the podcasts, all the TV series you've looked at in each of those 4 categories. And that'll give you a sense of the balance of the media that you're consuming. And if you look at that and you think, oh, actually, one of those is not really healthy, and I don't think that's sustainable long term, then here are a couple of tips to try and get the ball rolling in that particular area. You might want to choose, and I did this as a PhD student, and it was a real blessing to me. You might want to say 1 day a week is my week of Christian reading around my subject area. How to think through politics from a Christian point of view, or whatever it is. And then try and find some really, really good books on that and set aside a day a week, a morning a week, whatever you can manage, and have that as your Christian reading time. Another way to do it would be to make every 4th book you read, or every 2nd book you read, a Christian book. So once you've totted up 3 non-Christian disciplinary books, you say, right, I'm due for a Christian one now. Let's find out what that's going to be. So those are some hopefully practical thoughts about how to ground these theological principles, on a cold Monday morning when you wake up and get out of bed as an academic. What are you actually going to do? what I want to do now, and this is my final slide, is just to leave you with a few questions before we go into a discussion time about this. So first of all, just in terms of brute hours spent reading or watching or listening or thinking, what is the greatest influence on your view of the world, on your desires, and on your thinking? Secondly, to what extent are you actively seeking to develop a Christian understanding of your discipline? Number three, where are you in that diagram of the 4 C's, context, context, and so forth, at this point in your academic life? And finally, what aspects of what we've thought about today do you think before God need most addressing in your own life and studies? So I'm going to stop there. Let's move into a time of discussing this and thinking it through together and sharing wisdom with each other now.
Thank you so much. This is Jennifer back again, around from the other side of the table, just to clarify who's talking to you. Thank you so much. I believe we've got probably 7 minutes maybe for some questions. We might have some questions in the physical room here, maybe. And I'm not sure if there were some being fielded online, yeah or nay. Any questions in this particular space to start off? I've got one scribbled down here, but I'll hang fire. There's another one anyway. Time.
I have a question. I don't really know what the question is, but I think I guess I'm wondering at times when I feel a little bit overwhelmed by the world of my discipline. I don't know. There's usually a good reason for that, and I'm finding it more convincing. The worldviews and the positions of sort of my colleagues and the discipline. And I guess I can see usually that it's probably because I'm spending more time there than reading my Bible or reading about Christians in my discipline. I guess you've given some practical examples. Is there anything else that you would encourage? I don't know. I don't really know any Christians in my discipline, so that's probably a big one.
That's tough, isn't it? When you're trying to sort of navigate all this stuff alone. I think I would want to perhaps both say a word of encouragement and a word of caution about sort of feeling attracted to the arguments and positions of our disciplines. And I think the word of encouragement is it's sort of, in a sense, why on earth would we not be? If these disciplines have gained traction and developed over time, it's likely that there's going to be something to them, that there's going to be something that attracts people to that discipline, to that way of engaging with the world. And I think a good diagnostic question for us, rather than just thinking, oh, is it okay that I find myself agreeing with all this, is just to almost take a meta critique, and I apologize for the clumsy term, of that feeling and say, okay, why does this position sparkle? Why is it really attractive to the people who hold it? And why am I finding it attractive? And just sort of try and dig down a little bit into its assumptions and say, for the people who really like this, what is it that's attracting them to it? And that often helps you get under the bonnet of a particular position to try and fiddle around in its assumptions and say, oh, okay, it sees human beings in that way. And the people in the discipline really like that because that allows them to do this, or it allows them to use this analysis. And often that's really revealing as a question. So become the sort of critic of your own reaction to the discipline and say, why am I finding it attractive, and why do those people who love it really love it? But then I think that the note of caution, I guess, is that no academic discipline will have a biblical view of the world. And we want also to be asking the same sort of questions of that biblical view. So why why did I become a Christian in the first place? Why does Christianity sparkle to me again? What is it about that view of the world that is attractive? And I think if we're asking both of those sets of questions, we're not just engaging with the discipline, but we're also trying to go deeper in our understanding of the faith. It makes for a really healthy conversation between the two sets of commitments and assumptions from the Bible and from the discipline, where you're able to explore the similarities and differences in the way they look at the world. And that's not, you don't click your fingers and that suddenly happened. That's reading over weeks and months and thinking and chatting with friends. Yeah, so those would be my 2 points. But I do feel for you as a lone ranger in a discipline. I wonder if this group can do anything to help sort of hook people up with people in similar disciplines, because it can be pretty lonely and it can be pretty tough to do it alone. I agree.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I've got kind of a follow-up question for you in the same line, if you don't mind me kind of jumping in there. But if you had kind of one, I suppose, like first step kind of process for us about maybe if we're thinking about whether we're either being tempted to contribute to our discipline in a light of something other than the gospel. So either we feel tempted to just kind of lean into our disciplinary kind of setting and kind of keep it divorced from our faith, or just something that we want to know more and we just don't really know where to look. Is there, would you say there's a particular question that's worth asking when we're looking for particular resources, particularly say if it's like, I don't know where to look for, like, I off the top of my head can think of maybe 2 books that connect my discipline to my faith in an explicit way. Is there a particular question or process that you would go through for finding good kind of starting points for places to read, things like that?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, Jennifer. Thank you. Part of it is going to be an answer that sort of can work for everybody, and part of that is just going to be so specific to each individual discipline. So the bit that works for everybody, I think, is to be reading Christian stuff that engages intelligently with culture in general, and you pick up certain ways of thinking, certain moves to make, certain shapes of the way that the gospel relates to culture in general that then you can then use in a more specific context. And I guess thinkers there would definitely be John Stott. If you're not a Stott fan, I would encourage you to pick up New Issues Facing Christians Today is great, where he goes through lots of contemporary issues, thinking them through from a Christian point of view. And again, that's just helping you to learn how to think rather than what to think about specific things. I've got a little website where I bring some material together that might be useful for people, thinkingthroughthebible.com. And there is some, I think there's one of the posts on there is a bibliography, a little reading list of stuff that could be useful. But I think the other part of that answer is to try and read Christians writing in and about your specific discipline. And that's going to be different for all of us. So I can't really say, go and read these 2 books on all of the academic disciplines. There are reading lists. There's a group in Cambridge in the UK that's putting together just that sort of reading list now, where they've got all the different disciplines, and then these are the good Christian books you want to read. They haven't finished it yet, I think, but when they do, and that's up on the web, that's going to be a great resource. But short of that, I'm always happy to be emailed, and if people especially are in the arts and humanities, I can try and help out. But finding mature Christians in your discipline area and then shoot them an email off and see what they've read, that could be one way of trying to get that very specific advice.
Yeah, thank you. We have one question come through. I'm not sure if you can see in your chat space of Zoom or not, but do you want to have a stab at a STEM-based question? I know you're very much in philosophy, but the question, just for anyone who can't see it, what advice would you give to a Christian in STEM research where there's a feeling that a discipline like chemistry has less theological integration than the humanities?
Yeah, thank you. Another great question. So everything I say, obviously, is from someone outside the discipline. So you need to bear that in mind. I'm not intimately acquainted with the culture of chemistry. I would want to push back a little bit on the idea of what we mean by theological integration there in terms of the four categories. So it may not be that everything I'm doing in my discipline is in a very explicitly theological way, capturing it for Christ intellectually. But I, as a human being, am still going to be deeply theologically integrated in my interactions within the discipline. So if I'm lab-based, for example, that's a whole arena of relationships where being a Christian should make a huge difference to the way I relate to people and to the way I relate to the culture of the discipline. So I think I'd want to take that broader view of what it means to be integrated. And as I understand it, the whole sort of science and Christianity debate is a very fruitful one for Christians, and people talking, I suppose, in broader terms than very specific questions within chemistry, but on the broader level about how a biblical approach to reality relates to modern science. There's a great deal of writing there. And so perhaps part of that integration might be, rather than looking at my particular molecule, how do I think about that theologically, would be, how does the big picture of the way that my discipline sees the world, a discipline of chemistry or whatever it is, integrate with and talk to and get into conversation with the way that the Bible sees the world.
Now, it is 1 minute to 1. I might throw this final question to you, and then maybe all of us can have a think ourselves about what this could look like. But if you don't mind, just a brief kind of maybe a stab at the first 20 seconds at thinking about the Academy having no room for conscious disobedience what tips or examples would you give of being disobedient well, I suppose?
Yeah.
Is the question there.
The one sentence answer would be, don't fall off the donkey on either side. So I think it's easy to be extreme. It's easier to fall into either extreme. One extreme is, I'm never going to rock the boat because, goodness me, this is academia and everyone's so clever and I'm sure I'd be shot down in flames immediately. The other is to be sort of the pit bull terrier on the lookout for ways to take on the Academy for Christ around every corner. And my own experience of academic life is that nobody does things in order to be evil in their own mind. Like, people have good reasons for doing what they do. And a one-on-one conversation with people can often show you a side of things that was very inapparent beforehand. So if you think, oh my goodness, they're asking us to do that, how can they do that? That's ridiculous, that's awful, like, this is persecution. I guess the first step might be just to try and get a one-on-one, have a coffee with the person who did it, even if they're quite high up, and say, look, I find this really, I was really quite surprised that this is a policy. Can you talk me through where it came from? And often that conversation is really, really helpful. Oh, I see. Oh, that's what you're trying to do. You're not trying to do this thing there. You're trying to do, right. Okay. And sometimes that can just help to avoid misunderstanding. Now, it's not the whole story, of course, and there will be moments where you still have to say, well, actually, I can't do that. But it helps to eliminate those cases where we've simply misunderstood a new policy or something that's come down.
Thank you. We are right just after 1 o'clock, so we will stop on the question front. Thank you again so much. I might just quickly pray for you and for us, and then we'll close up. Dear Lord, thank you for this time together to reflect on what it means for us to be your followers in the Academy, no matter where in the Academy we are. Thank you for speaking to us through Chris today, and for the way that you have guided him to quite strongly integrate some of his research with his faith in the Thinking Through the Bible project and such. We pray for each of us here in the room and those online now or watching later, that you will really prompt us to think about what it is for us to follow you in our work, in our research, in our study. And we thank you again for the way that we can connect as your people, even in these difficult times. We pray these things in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
And just before we all close off, I'd like to, one, kind of pre-spruik that there will be further EPS seminars down the track, so keep your eyes and ears out. And also for those of you that may be available on the 4th of August for the ANCON Postgrad and Staff Day, it'll be Mark Stevens from the Centre for Public Christianity speaking, among some other things, on that day. So if you're available and would like to come along, please do so. We'd love to see you there. So we will thank Chris again. I suppose we can give him a little round of applause. And we will, I suppose, continue our conversations offline now.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
very much.
everybody, for coming. It was wonderful to interact with you. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you so much. Someone's just said thank you for your thought-provoking presentation with a wry smile.
Thought-provoking, yes.
Thought-provoking.